For over 3 decades, Fall of El Mayo Zambada was a phantom, a mythic figure who operated one of the world's most violent criminal organizations without ever facing a court. He outmaneuvered armies, presidents, and rivals while building a criminal empire that generated billions in revenue and left devastation in its wake. But that illusion of invincibility shattered in a Brooklyn courtroom. U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi announced what had seemed impossible. El Mayo stood before a federal judge, admitted his guilt, and accepted that he will die in a U.S. federal prison. This wasn't just a legal victory. It was the symbolic collapse of the last legendary figure of the Sinaloa Cartel. His guilty plea exposed the true scale of his empire and the weakness that allowed it to fall. For over 20 years, Zambada was a ghost, protected by a web of loyalty, corruption, and fear. Law enforcement called him the last untouchable. Even after his partner, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, was captured in 2016 and his sons were hunted down, El Mayo remained free. The DEA, the FBI, and Homeland Security spent billions tracking his operations. He was always one step ahead. But in 2024, that changed. In a move no one expected, Zambada was cornered during a covert operation in Texas. This was the result of an aggressive push by the Trump administration to treat major cartels as terrorist organizations. Pam Bondi's announcement of his plea was a victory, decades in the making. She credited not just law enforcement, but an unprecedented level of pressure on the Mexican government that made extradition inevitable. She reminded the public of what the Sinaloa Cartel had done, the flood of cocaine, heroin, and fentanyl that destroyed communities across the U.S. She also spoke of the corruption that hollowed out institutions on both sides of the border and the murders that followed the cartel's bloody rise. "He will never walk free again," she said. "The man who poisoned U.S. streets and destroyed countless families will die in the place he belongs." The plea itself was meticulous. Zambada admitted to running a criminal enterprise since 1989. He acknowledged that he oversaw the cultivation, transportation, and distribution of narcotics across continents, making billions in revenue and enforcing his rule with violence and bribery. Court documents showed how he authorized hits, coordinated huge shipments, and manipulated political systems to ensure the cartel's dominance. What was surprising was his tone.
Before we get to that, I need your help. I'm trying to hit 50,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and I need your help. So I would really appreciate it if you could subscribe and help me out.
Zambada expressed remorse for the lives destroyed by the system he built. He said, "I cannot change what I did, but I accept the justice of this court." This acceptance doesn't erase the brutality of his empire. From the hills of Sinaloa to the streets of Chicago and New York, El Mayo's network turned entire neighborhoods into battlegrounds. It fueled addiction crises and corrupted officials from low-level police officers to high-ranking politicians. Analysts said his cartel used a hybrid model, part family business, part corporate syndicate, and part paramilitary force. This mix of ruthless efficiency and strategic patience allowed him to stay free for so long. But when the end came, it was not in a dramatic shootout. It was in a quiet courtroom where the man who once commanded armies of hitmen faced the full weight of the U.S. system he had mocked for decades. The plea deal was complex. Mexico, which opposes the death penalty, made it clear that any extradition agreement would exclude it. The U.S. Justice Department wanted to avoid a long trial that could endanger witnesses, so they accepted the terms. In return, Zambada's cooperation could provide intelligence to dismantle the rest of his cartel's network. This prospect gave officials reason for optimism. Pam Bondi said this was more than one man's sentence. She said it was about dismantling a machine of death and addiction, piece by piece. The emotional impact of the announcement was heightened by its timing. Just 6 years earlier, El Chapo, Zambada's partner, was sentenced to life in the same federal system. Together, their convictions close a chapter in the history of the Sinaloa Cartel, a history that shaped drug enforcement for a generation. The Justice Department presented the moment as the result of a strategy to hold kingpins accountable. not through secret deals or staged shootouts, but in the public view of U.S. courts. This strategy sends a clear message. No matter how long it takes, no matter how deep the corruption runs, there will be no safe place for those who profit from blood and poison. For the families who lost loved ones to fentanyl overdoses and for the communities terrorized by cartel violence, the announcement carried a weight that statistics can't capture. It was not just about punishment, it was about recognition. It was a sign that their suffering was not unseen, that the people behind the headlines mattered, and that justice, even when delayed, could still feel like justice. Advocacy groups praised the move, calling it a historic turning point in the fight against organized crime. But they also warned that the fall of one man does not end the problem. The cartels are like a hydra. If you cut off one head, another grows. Bondi understood this reality. She used the moment to call for continued vigilance. She acknowledged the void that Zambada's fall would create, a vacuum that smaller, more unstable groups will try to fill. But she argued that the symbolic power of the plea could shift the balance in ways that simple statistics or drug seizures never could. The plea strips away the myth, she said, and leaves only the truth. That the so-called legends of the drug war end not as heroes, but as inmates, alone and forgotten. The plea also highlights the political stakes of the drug war. For years, cooperation between the U.S. and Mexico has been strained by mistrust, corruption scandals, and changing political goals. The Zambada case is a rare example where that cooperation worked smoothly, with intelligence sharing and coordinated operations leading to a clean arrest and fast extradition. Diplomats noted that this success could be a model for future cross-border operations, a rare point of agreement in an otherwise tense relationship. As the legal process moves towards sentencing, Zambada's story offers a harsh lesson. Power built on violence and fear can seem unbreakable, but it is always temporary. The same networks that kept him untouchable, corrupt officials, loyal lieutenants, and communities too terrified to speak, wore down over time. This created cracks that law enforcement finally exploited. In the end, what toppled the last leader of the Sinaloa Cartel was not a rival's bullet or an internal betrayal. It was the relentless pressure of a system that refused to forget. It tracked every wire transfer, every shipment, and every whispered conversation until there was nowhere left to hide.
Before we get to that, I need your help. I'm trying to hit 50,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and I need your help. So I would really appreciate it if you could subscribe and help me out.
Pam Bondi's announcement made this truth clear. No empire is beyond being held accountable. Ismael El Mayo Zambada, the man who defined an era of organized crime, will spend the rest of his life behind bars, just like the men he once commanded. It's a conclusion that feels almost simple, but it has an impact that goes far beyond one courtroom. For law enforcement, it proves that decades of work were worth it. For communities scarred by his empire, it offers a rare sense of closure. For anyone still drawn to the myth of the untouchable kingpin, it serves as an undeniable reality check. Every legend ends, and this one ends in a cell. What happens next will shape the future of the drug war. The dismantling of Zambada's network will test whether the intelligence gained from his cooperation can actually stop the flow of narcotics, or whether the cartel, broken but not destroyed, will just adapt and survive. But for now, the focus is on the moment itself, the quiet but powerful shift that happened when the last great architect of the Sinaloa Cartel finally said the word that law enforcement had waited a generation to hear: guilty. That single word closed a story that began in the mountains of Sinaloa decades ago and echoed through every street and courtroom touched by the poison he helped spread. Bondi's announcement was sharp and left no room for doubt. This was not just a legal formality, it was a final judgment. For a country still dealing with the human cost of an epidemic fueled by men like Zambada, it was a reminder that even in a fight that feels endless, moments of undeniable justice are still possible. U.S. and Mexican intelligence had been working for more than 2 decades to pressure El Mayo's legal team and arrest him before the guilty plea was made. U.S. law enforcement sought Ismael El Mayo Zambada for over 20 years until his arrest in Texas in July 2024. The effort intensified over the years with continued diplomatic, intelligence, and law enforcement cooperation between the U.S. and Mexico. This included the Trump administration, which increased pressure to break up drug cartels. The multi-year effort involved tracking his movements, gathering evidence, and working on extradition deals, which finally led to his capture and the legal deal announced in 2025. He had a team of skilled lawyers who acted as gears grinding against extradition and conviction. His freedom punched holes in the fight against the drug trade. The U.S. and Mexico did not give up. They layered pressure with intelligence sharing, secret indictments, financial tracking, wire interceptions, and legal steps. They collected information and fixed diplomatic problems. The Trump administration sped up covert operations. Every surveillance wire, every trafficker who became an informant, every money laundering paper trail tightened the story. The solution was not force, it was relentless precision, turning decades of small victories into the final, inescapable moment, his arrest and plea. This is not guesswork. The Associated Press reported that U.S. and Mexican intelligence had been pressuring his legal team for more than 2 decades before a guilty plea appeared. Reuters confirmed he was sought for over 20 years until his arrest in Texas in July 2024. CBS News and the BBC cited growing collaboration, including under the Trump administration's ramped-up efforts to break up cartels. The result was a multi-year, multi-agency, 2-nation push that led to a 2025 legal deal. This shows the hidden gears turning behind headlines. The intelligence briefs, the diplomatic moves, the courtroom strategies finally gave way. 2 decades, an entire lifetime of strategy, shadows, negotiation, and nerve. Then, in Texas in July 2024, a plea was made, final and real. For communities hurt by cartel violence, it was a relief that was hard-won and long overdue. For institutions often criticized as slow or corrupt, it was vindication. With persistence and partnership, even the quietest leak can become a flood. The chase was not cinematic. It was persistence, alliances, legal rigor, and moral urgency coming together until nothing remained between him and justice. That's the power of staying informed and believing that even the longest hunts can end in a victory. Now, after years of silence and evasion, the man who never set foot in a U.S. courtroom until this year has pleaded guilty to 2 serious federal charges: racketeering conspiracy and running a continuing criminal enterprise. This moment rewrites the history of modern organized crime. With his admission, Zambada himself confirmed the inner workings, the violence, and the corruption that sustained one of the most lethal criminal groups in history. The first charge, racketeering conspiracy, shows the wide reach of his command. It was not just about drugs, it was about running a system, a criminal government that moved with military-like precision. The second charge, running a continuing criminal enterprise, reveals the scale: 35 years at the head of an operation that put poison into American streets while corrupting the highest levels of power in Mexico. From 1989 on, El Mayo did not just lead the cartel, he built its structure. This included the roots, the bribery, pipelines, and the alliances that made the Sinaloa Cartel a global empire that brought in billions in revenue. What makes this plea so important is what Zambada chose to admit. In a calm voice in a Brooklyn courtroom, he acknowledged that his organization had trafficked at least 1.5 million kilograms of cocaine since 1980. That huge number represents decades of addiction, violence, and death. He confirmed what investigators had long suspected but could not fully prove: that the cartel had a network of bribes that reached into every layer of the Mexican government. This included police commanders, military generals, and even politicians whose campaigns were paid for in exchange for protection and access. The corruption was not random. It was a strategic, planned, and key part of the cartel's survival. He revealed the operational skill that made the Sinaloa Cartel untouchable for so long. Boats disguised as fishing vessels carried loads from Colombia. Private planes moved shipments across borders. Trucks and trains rolled across highways with protected cargo. Even tunnels, some with rails and airflow, moved drugs beneath the border, right under the noses of U.S. authorities. These were not the actions of a street gang, they were the logistics of a multinational company, and Zambada was its CEO. For all its sophistication, the empire ran on violence. Zambada admitted to ordering murders of rival traffickers, witnesses, law enforcement officers, and anyone seen as a threat. Violence was currency. Fear was strategy. Entire regions of Mexico lived under a reign of terror where the line between government power and cartel power blurred until it was gone. This, more than anything, explains the chilling strength of his rule. Communities where the cartel was the law, where bribes bought loyalty, and bullets enforced silence. Perhaps the most shocking admission in his plea was about the internal politics of power. Zambada confirmed that disputes over territory were not just about land. They were about billions in revenue, and the kind of influence that could change entire elections. Betrayals often ended in death. Allies became enemies. Families were torn apart. Through it all, Zambada kept an almost mythical presence. He was rarely seen, always obeyed. He was a man who understood that being invisible was his greatest defense. The guilty plea also came with a huge financial penalty, a $15 billion forfeiture judgment. That figure shows not just profits, but the raw power the cartel had. Money was laundered through real estate, fake companies, offshore accounts, and legitimate businesses. It is a number that exposes the economic force of the drug trade, a hidden economy that paid for everything from expensive lifestyles to local groups in poor towns. For years, that money protected Zambada from betrayal and being charged. Now it will be taken apart, turned into evidence of just how much the cartel took from decades of pain and death. Then came something few expected: remorse. Zambada, now in his mid-70s, spoke directly about the human cost of his empire. He acknowledged the families destroyed by addiction, the communities ruined by violence, and the harmful effect of a system where crime paid better than any legal path. "I accept responsibility," he said. Whether the remorse was a tactic or real, it was a moment where the cartel's most hidden figure humanized the damage his choices caused. For the U.S. government, this plea is more than a victory. It is a confirmation. For years, DEA agents, prosecutors in New York, and investigators across several administrations built cases piece by piece, often with public doubt. Now, the very man they chased has confirmed what they have argued for decades, that the Sinaloa Cartel was not just a drug operation, but a parallel power structure that hurt law, order, and democracy itself. Attorney General statements have stressed that this case is proof that no one, not even the most protected, is beyond the reach of justice. In Mexico, the effects are far more volatile. Zambada's admissions have sent shockwaves through political and security circles. His admission of systemic bribery and political interference points fingers at figures who still have power. The plea has sparked calls for deeper investigations, for accountability that goes beyond the low-level officers often blamed in anti-corruption campaigns. It is a test for the current government, whether to face the uncomfortable truth of a government deeply infiltrated by crime, or to hide the revelations for political reasons. For ordinary people in Mexico, the plea has brought both a sense of vindication and of cynicism. Vindication because the truth they have lived with for decades, that the violence, the disappearances, the feeling of living under occupation, was not paranoia, but policy. Cynicism because history has taught them that even the most shocking revelations rarely lead to real change. The fall of one man does not dismantle the cartel. The system he built is bigger than the man himself, and that fact looms over any celebration of justice. Still, there is power in the symbolism. For families who have lost children to addiction, for communities terrorized by violence, And for agents who have spent their careers chasing shadows, this moment offers a rare sense of accountability. The man who once stood for being above the law now sits in a cell, waiting for his sentence. His empire is exposed, and his fortune is claimed by the very government he spent decades defying. It is not full closure, as the pain runs too deep, but it is a final judgment that forces both countries to face the cost of looking the other way for so long. For decades, the name Ismael El Mayo Zambada was whispered with fear and respect. He was the phantom kingpin, the man who outsmarted the DEA, Mexican Marines, and international intelligence agencies. His myth was built on being elusive, on the idea that no one could touch him, not even when his partners fell one by one. That myth is dead. With his guilty plea in a U.S. courtroom, El Mayo did not just admit to his crimes. He destroyed the legacy of invincibility that the Sinaloa Cartel built around him. And in doing so, he caused a humiliation that will echo through the organization for years to come. The first crack in the facade is the shattering of his untouchable image. For over 40 years, El Mayo avoided the fate of his contemporaries. There were no handcuffs, no mugshots, and no courtroom drawings. He was the ghost who ran one of the most powerful drug empires in history. Even as Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was shown to the world as the face of Mexican drug violence, El Mayo stayed in the shadows, controlling routes, money, and men with surgical precision. That image of eternal control was everything. It kept rivals away, inspired loyalty among his lieutenants, and terrified anyone who thought about betraying him. His guilty plea collapses that mythology. The man who was impossible to catch is now an inmate, proof that even the highest walls will eventually crumble. But this plea is not just about appearances. It is about confession. In court, El Mayo admitted to what the world already knew, but what the cartel always denied: the trafficking of hundreds of tons of drugs, the systematic bribery of officials, and the organization of violence that left entire communities soaked in fear. For decades, the Sinaloa Cartel gave the impression of being in control and inevitable, a force above the law, unshaken by governments or borders. By pleading guilty, El Mayo himself put that illusion to rest. His admission is a direct blow to the heart of the cartel's propaganda, a public acknowledgement that their empire is one of crime, blood, and corruption, not destiny. Perhaps most damaging is what his plea revealed about the rot that made such power possible: political corruption. El Mayo did not just bribe low-level cops or border officials. According to court filings and reports, his influence reached deep into Mexico's political and law enforcement institutions. Governors, military commanders, and federal agents looked the other way, not because of fear, but because they were paid to. His admission shines a light on a system that allowed a criminal organization to act like a parallel government. For the Sinaloa Cartel, this is a disaster for its legacy. They have always wanted to be seen as kings of the underworld, feared for their strength and ruthlessness. Now the story changes. They were not all-powerful warriors. They were businessmen buying protection in a corrupted system. That erodes the mystique and leaves behind a smell of weakness and dependency. Inside the cartel, the loss of a stable leader is a huge blow. El Mayo was not just a figurehead. He was the anchor. While rivals broke apart and fought, the Sinaloa Cartel stayed mostly together because of his steady, almost invisible hand. He settled disputes, balanced power among groups, and made sure that operations ran smoothly even in times of chaos. His absence creates a dangerous vacuum. Younger, more reckless figures, some already in conflict with each other, now fight for dominance. That instability not only threatens the cartel's operations, it threatens its very existence. A broken organization is vulnerable to rivals, to law enforcement, and, most deadly, to its own internal collapse. For U.S. and Mexican authorities, this plea is a symbolic triumph. For years, capturing El Mayo was considered impossible, a fantasy that fueled political speeches but never became reality. His guilty plea changes that. It shows that persistence, intelligence sharing, and international coordination can break even the most protected criminal networks. This symbolism matters. It sends a message not just to the Sinaloa Cartel, but to every criminal organization watching. No one is beyond reach. That psychological blow is as important as the legal one, harming morale and planting seeds of doubt among operatives who once believed in the myth of eternal protection. Then there is the money, which has always been at the heart of the cartel's power. The $15 billion forfeiture connected to El Mayo's plea is not just a number. It is a spotlight on the huge wealth that funded corruption, violence, and political influence. By forcing the forfeiture of these assets, authorities did not just expose the scale of the fortune, they revealed its fragility. The cartel has long thrived on the idea of untouchable wealth, endless cash, and infinite resources that could wash away any problem. That illusion is now broken. To see their leader stripped of billions sends a chilling signal. The financial armor that once seemed impenetrable is now vulnerable to being seized and disrupted. The humiliation of this moment goes far beyond courtrooms. On the streets of Culiacan, in the halls of power in Mexico City, and in the secret rooms where deals are made from Colombia to Chicago, people are rethinking things. Allies begin to doubt, rivals smell opportunity, and the foot soldiers, the drivers, the hitmen, the couriers, are forced to face a brutal truth. The empire they believed was unbreakable is bleeding. What makes this downfall so brutal is the way it breaks down the psychology of fear and respect that the cartel relied on. For decades, the story was simple. Sinaloa does not fall. Governments change, presidents come and go, but the cartel endures. That story dies with El Mayo's plea. The organization can try to spin it, to play it down, to insist that the business continues. But symbols matter. And when the ultimate symbol of invincibility kneels in a U.S. courtroom, no amount of bravado can erase that image. There is also a generational part to this collapse. El Mayo represented an old-school way of doing things, a quiet, strategic approach to power that was different from the showy violence of newer players. His exit leaves a leadership gap that is unlikely to be filled with the same level of discipline. Younger figures, many raised in the chaos of cartel wars, are driven by ego and the need to show their dominance publicly. That shift could speed up the cartel's fragmentation and lead to more violence, both inside the group and with other territories. For communities already hurt by cartel violence, this instability is a ticking time bomb. Internationally, the guilty plea changes the story around the war on drugs. For years, critics said that major traffickers were untouchable, that arrests and seizures were just for show. El Mayo's admission of guilt delivers a counterpunch to that cynicism. It proves that the machinery of justice, though slow and flawed, can still bring down the giants. The story of El Mayo was one of cunning, strength, and unbreakable will. That story has been rewritten, not by rivals or enemies, but by his own voice in a courtroom. By admitting his crimes, he did not just confess, he wrote the final chapter of his own legend. And in that act, he exposed the cartel for what it is. Not a deathless empire, but a criminal enterprise subject to the same forces of law, betrayal, and decay that have ended every empire before it. The guilty plea of Ismael El Mayo Zambada is not just a legal event, it is a cultural break. It takes away decades of mythology, forces a final judgment within the cartel, and redefines what power looks like in the criminal underworld. For the Sinaloa Cartel, this is more than a loss. It is a humiliation shown to the world, a moment that will be studied and remembered as the point where the myth of invincibility finally collapsed. For those who believed that some men were beyond the reach of justice, it is a reminder that even the most carefully built legends eventually fall. It began with a silence that felt heavier than the marble walls of the courtroom. The man at the defense table had been, for decades, the ghost no one could catch. Ismael El Mayo Zambada, the co-founder and shadow architect of the Sinaloa Cartel, uttered two words that would be heard across two nations. Guilty, Your Honor. The tension in the room instantly broke. For prosecutors and federal agents who had spent their careers chasing this elusive figure, it was vindication and a victory, years in the making. Pam Bondi called it a landmark victory that ensured El Mayo would spend the rest of his life where he belongs, in a U.S. federal prison. The phrase hung in the air, a final end to a story that had once seemed endless. For decades, El Mayo had been the invisible hand guiding one of the world's most violent empires. Other leaders had fallen, but he remained, adapting and surviving, directing the flow of poison north and money south. That myth of invincibility collapsed in a single plea, seen by a room full of people who understood its weight. Bondi's praise of relentless efforts was not an exaggeration. Agents spoke in quiet tones about years of detailed intelligence work, covert surveillance, and the dangerous infiltration of a cartel that had perfected intimidation. For them, this was proof that patience and persistence could break through even the deepest shadows. El Mayo's voice, quiet but steady, spoke of remorse, of damage done, of communities in both Mexico and the U.S. ruined by violence and addiction. Even more striking was his plea to Sinaloa, a request for calm, a plea that the state he once ruled with silent authority not drown in bloodshed as power struggles started. In the void, his absence would leave. It was as close to a confession as the world had ever heard from him, a quiet acknowledgement that even legends can break. But the importance of that day went beyond symbolism. Legally, the plea exploded like a precision strike inside the cartel's leadership. For the lieutenants still operating, men known to federal agents and whispered about in fear across the mountains of northern Mexico, the message was clear: the untouchable had been touched. Federal prosecutors immediately made it clear that this was only the start. Intelligence gained during the plea process would be used, charges were coming, assets would be frozen. Safe houses that had always felt untouchable suddenly felt exposed. The fear spread immediately. Conversations intercepted in the days that followed showed panic. Lieutenants wondered which of their secrets were now in the hands of the very agencies they had spent years trying to outsmart. Some went into hiding. Others tried to make deals, desperate to buy time. But the thinking had shifted. If El Mayo could be cornered, anyone could. Cartel power lives on perception, the belief that certain men are beyond the reach of law and consequence. That illusion shattered in that courtroom, and with it, the operational landscape for the Sinaloa Cartel broke even further. Already split by the rise of Los Chapitos, the Sons of El Chapo, and other groups fighting for territory, the organization now faced a new, unstable reality. A leadership void filled with distrust and fear. Federal officials understood this well. Behind closed doors, strategies were changed to use the chaos. The plea did not just deliver a trophy conviction, it provided a map, a blueprint of logistics, routes, and, most dangerously, the political figures who had helped the empire. Those names, long protected by layers of deniability, were suddenly in danger. And that fear spread like wildfire, not just in Sinaloa but in boardrooms, campaign offices, and police departments where favors had been exchanged for silence. Pam Bondi called it justice. For communities hollowed out by the violence the cartel left behind, it felt like something more complicated, a moment of relief mixed with the uneasy knowledge that the violence would not simply go away. The plea may have cut off the head of the cartel's mythology, but the organization itself, wounded, angry, and unpredictable, still moved. There is no denying the practical impact of the plea. The U.S. now holds not just a man, but a trove of intelligence that will guide operations for years. Every shipment, every wire transfer, every whispered conversation between lieutenants now carries more risk than ever before. For agents who have spent their careers building cases in the shadows, that shift is huge. The emotional story of that day is hard to overstate. There was triumph, but also a sobering awareness of what had been lost in the decades leading up to it. Tens of thousands of lives across 2 countries, families torn apart, and communities ravaged. El Mayo's quiet apology could not erase that. But in that moment, it was a recognition that the human cost of his empire was undeniable. This is what makes the plea so important. It is not just about one man serving life in a cell. It is about the chain of events his admission will cause, the intelligence that will dismantle networks, the fear that will destroy loyalty, and the breaking up that will make the cartel weaker, more unpredictable, and easier to target. It is about the precedent that no one, not even the ghost of Sinaloa, is beyond being held accountable. In the days since, federal prosecutors have made it clear, this momentum will not be wasted. Task forces are growing, charges are being prepared, and cooperation agreements are being used to peel back layers of secrecy that have protected the cartel for decades. What was once a fortress is now a house full of cracks, and every crack is an opportunity. The guilty plea of Ismael El Mayo Zambada is more than a headline. It is a powerful event shaking the foundations of the Sinaloa Cartel. For decades, El Mayo was the ghost in the machine, the strategist who kept one of the world's most powerful criminal empires from falling apart. His quiet authority balanced unstable groups, settled disputes, and kept a ruthless but working order that allowed the cartel to thrive despite constant outside pressure. That balance is gone. What comes next may be the most dangerous phase the cartel and Mexico have seen in decades. From the moment the news of the plea broke, tension rose across the cartel's ranks. Men who once swore loyalty to El Mayo now find themselves in a leaderless maze, with fear and ambition driving every move. The void he leaves is not just symbolic, it is operational. El Mayo was not just a figurehead. He was the architect of alliances, the keeper of secrets, the one who knew how to turn rivalries into cooperation when the stakes were high. Without him, every decision, every shipment, and every negotiation is now a potential spark in a powder keg. The most immediate threat is the growing conflict between Los Chapitos, the sons of El Chapo, and the remaining Zambada loyalists. These groups tolerated each other under El Mayo's watch because they trusted his ability to divide power and profits evenly enough to keep the machine running. That trust is now shattered. Early signs point to small but clear escalations: territory disputes in Culiacan, suspicious disappearances of mid-level operatives, and whispers of alliances forming with rival groups eager to use the instability. In Sinaloa state alone, more than 2,200 people were killed, and another 1,400 went missing in the last year during internal fights. The danger is not limited to internal chaos. El Mayo's plea, and the cooperation that likely came with it, sent shockwaves far beyond the cartel's strongholds. Prosecutors now have a roadmap of internal operations, corrupt networks, and key players who once operated in the shadows. This revelation destroys the culture of being above the law that protected the cartel for decades. Every operative, from senior lieutenants to regional bosses, must now face the terrifying reality that their names, routes, and methods may already be in the hands of U.S. authorities. The psychology of paranoia is setting in. In an organization where trust was already weak, paranoia is poison. That paranoia creates violence. Loyalty is no longer a shield, it is a danger. Operators who fear they might be exposed are more likely to defect, strike first, or turn on allies before those allies can turn on them. What is emerging is a climate of betrayal, a deadly game where being slow is fatal, and where the urge to act first, no matter the results, grows stronger every day. It is not just a matter of who controls the flow of drugs, it is a matter of who survives the cleansing that this plea has unleashed. Meanwhile, outside pressure is building. El Mayo's guilty plea is being celebrated by U.S. authorities as a landmark victory, and that victory sets the stage for an even more aggressive wave of enforcement. Every name and detail that came out during his cooperation provides new leads for investigations, new targets for charges, and new opportunities to break up the infrastructure that keeps the cartel alive. For the men still operating, this creates a two-front war, defending territory and profits from rivals while dodging the tightening net of law enforcement. That kind of stress has broken criminal organizations before, and all signs point to a similar collapse being not just possible, but unavoidable. What makes this moment so dangerous is the cartel's size and influence. The Sinaloa Cartel is a multinational enterprise with ties to politics, law enforcement, and legal businesses. Breaking it up will not just mean more violence in Mexico, it will send shockwaves through supply chains, alliances, and rivalries across the Americas and beyond. Other groups, like the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, will see opportunity in the chaos. And when very violent rivals move into power vacuums, history shows the result is rarely controlled. For communities caught in the crossfire, the human cost is huge. Ordinary families in Sinaloa, Sonora, and Durango are preparing for what they already feel is coming: an increase in violence as groups settle scores and enforce shifting loyalties with bullets and disappearances. Local economies that depend on cartel money are now unstable as leadership fractures, leaving people not just afraid, but poor. And the government, already struggling to contain violence, faces the grim prospect of even more fractured and unpredictable conflicts spreading into cities. For the low-level operatives, the plea sends a clear message: no one is untouchable. The man who evaded arrest for decades is now in U.S. custody, admitting guilt. That realization changes the plan for survival. Some will use more violence in a desperate attempt to prove their worth. Others will look for a way out, whether by cooperating with authorities, running away, or making deals with rival groups. Each of those choices, multiplied across dozens of groups and hundreds of operators, increases the likelihood of unpredictable and violent results. Psychologically, this is a breaking point. The feeling of being invincible that shielded the cartel for years has been broken, and with it, the sense of inevitability that kept internal conflicts in check. Fear, once a force that held the cartel together, is now tearing it apart. When fear replaces discipline, the slide toward collapse speeds up. Reports from within Sinaloa already show more kidnappings, targeted murders, and unsanctioned territory grabs. Intelligence sources point to younger, more reckless lieutenants seizing opportunities left by the lack of clear leadership, often with little regard for the long-term stability of the organization. These moves create a cycle of violence. One murder triggers another, one betrayal leads to a chain reaction of revenge that no one can fully control. The plea also changes how the cartel is seen from the outside. For decades, the Sinaloa brand had a dark prestige, disciplined, strategic, and stable compared to rivals. That image is now fading. With its most respected leader publicly admitting guilt and facing life in prison, partners may seek safer options. Rivals will sense weakness, and the carefully built myth of Sinaloa as the smart cartel may crumble. Ultimately, what makes this moment so dangerous is that there is no clear path forward. To stabilize the cartel would need a figure who can command respect across all groups, rebuild internal trust, and negotiate to prevent rivals from taking advantage of the moment. But no such figure exists. The collapse will not happen overnight. Instead, what we are seeing is a slow-motion breaking apart, a process where alliances disappear, violence increases, and the very structure of the cartel changes into smaller, more chaotic groups. As history has shown in places like Colombia, that kind of fragmentation often leads to more violence, not less. The lesson is clear. El Mayo's guilty plea is not just the end of an era. It is the beginning of a dangerous transition. The stability that allowed the Sinaloa Cartel to dominate for decades is gone. In its place is uncertainty, fear, and a scramble for power that will leave no one untouched. The question is not whether the cartel will break apart. It is how violently, how quickly, and at what cost that break will come. The quiet halls of power in Washington have been busy ever since Ismael El Mayo Zambada's guilty plea became public. Now the Phantom has stepped into the light, not by choice, but by force. His plea has exploded through the criminal underworld like a shockwave, and U.S. prosecutors are moving with a precision that suggests one singular goal: the complete dismantling of the Sinaloa Cartel's infrastructure piece by piece until nothing remains. What makes this moment so extraordinary is the depth of intelligence Zambada's cooperation provides. For years, the DEA and FBI knew only small parts of how the cartel worked. Now, with Zambada on the record, that view has opened into a full picture. He knows the command structure, the financial networks, the hidden faces behind the violence, and the politicians who quietly help the trafficking machinery. Prosecutors are already turning this information into actionable leads, building a roadmap that points to lieutenants, accountants, and regional bosses who have so far escaped capture. It is no longer just about catching dealers or stopping shipments. It is about unraveling the very core of the organization. This is not a solo effort. A group of agencies is working together with a unity that was not possible even a decade ago. The Department of Justice, DEA, FBI, and Homeland Security are lining up strategies with Mexico's law enforcement in a way that shows decisive control. Cross-border operations are being coordinated to disrupt the lifelines of trafficking, the routes through Sonora, the safe houses in Tijuana, the banking points in Europe and Asia. Every move is calculated. Every raid built on intelligence extracted from the cracks Zambada himself exposed. What once seemed like an impenetrable empire is now a chessboard where U.S. prosecutors control more pieces than ever before. Money, the blood of the cartel, is now being targeted. Zambada's $15 billion forfeiture is a strategy. By stripping the organization of its assets, prosecutors are cutting off the flow of cash that pays for bribes, weapons, and logistics. Bank accounts are being frozen, fake companies dismantled, and properties seized in real time. This financial attack is surgical, designed not just to punish, but to disable. The Sinaloa Cartel thrived because it had the money to outspend and outsmart law enforcement. Now, for the first time, that advantage is collapsing. With every account closed and every property taken, the message gets louder. The era of untouchable cartel wealth is ending, but the fight is far from over, and the prosecutors know it. This phase is about targeting the middle and top levels, the lieutenants and regional commanders who kept the cartel's gears turning, while leaders like Zambada stayed protected. These men know the streets and control the daily operations that keep the drugs flowing north and the money flowing south. By using Zambada's information, prosecutors are mapping these networks and building strong cases designed to survive years of legal fighting. Every charge is a scalpel aimed at the heart of the organization's leadership structure. Every arrest chips away at the illusion of invincibility that the Sinaloa name once carried. Public messaging is another weapon in this campaign. Zambada's plea is being broadcast as a cautionary tale, a warning to anyone who still believes in the myth of the untouchable trafficker. The image of El Mayo, once the ghost in the hills of Sinaloa, now reduced to a man facing life in a U.S. prison, is a powerful deterrent. Prosecutors are using it to break morale inside the cartel and to show the world that even the most elusive figures can be brought to justice. It is psychological warfare as much as legal action, a planned effort to destroy the culture of fear and loyalty that has protected the cartel for decades. This effort also relies heavily on diplomacy. U.S. prosecutors and diplomats are in constant talks with Mexican authorities to speed up extraditions and ensure that the intelligence pipeline remains unbroken. The cooperation does not stop at the border. European and Asian partners are being included in operations targeting money laundering hubs and synthetic drug supply chains. This level of coordination means that the cartel can no longer rely on gaps in legal systems to protect its global operations. Every safe place is shrinking, every loophole closing, as international law enforcement begins to move together. For the communities torn apart by cartel violence, this moment brings a sense of fragile hope. The plea deal, the asset seizures, the synchronized raids, all of it points to a strategy aimed at the core of the problem, not just the symptoms. The emotional stakes are huge because this is not just about taking down a man. It is about dismantling a system that has thrived on fear and being above the law for decades. However, there is no illusion about the challenges ahead. Cartels adapt. New leaders rise, networks change, but prosecutors believe that by gutting the financial base, isolating key operatives, and tightening international cooperation, they can deliver a blow that the cartel cannot recover from. It is a high-stakes act, balancing aggressive action with the patience needed to build strong cases. Every step must be precise because the stakes, human lives, international credibility, and the future of the drug trade, are too high for mistakes. This is what makes Zambada's plea a turning point. It is not just a legal milestone, it is the lever that prosecutors are using to pry open an empire that once seemed unshakable. The intelligence harvested from his cooperation is being turned into a weaponized strategy, one that combines legal pressure, financial disruption, operational strikes, and psychological messaging into a unified campaign. For the first time, the Sinaloa Cartel is not dictating the pace of the game. The prosecutors are. As the operation speeds up, the clock is ticking for those still holding on to the remnants of Zambada's empire. Each week brings new charges, new seizures, and new names added to the target lists. With every move, the net tightens. This is not just about winning cases, it is about changing the balance of power in the war on organized crime. The takedown phase has begun, and it is methodical and relentless. The myth of Sinaloa's untouchability has been shattered, and in its place is a reality that traffickers everywhere will have to face. Cooperation can break down an empire, and the law, when used with precision, can reach even the highest, most elusive figures. The story of El Mayo Zambada will be told for years, but the real legacy will be measured in what follows. If prosecutors succeed in their mission, the final chapter of the Sinaloa Cartel will not be written in the wealth of mansions or the violence of plazas, but in the quiet, methodical collapse of a network that once spanned the globe. When that moment comes, it will not just be a victory in a courtroom, it will be the confirmation that an empire built on fear can at last be brought to its knees.